Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, man. Could you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure, I'm glad to do that. My name is Peter Elkind. I'm a journalist, writer. I've worked as a journalist for 40 plus years, for Texas Monthly, for Fortune Magazine for 20, and most recently, the last 5 or 6 years for ProPublica, where I'm on staff. And I've in the process, I've written or co-authored 3 books. A book about Enron called The Smartest Book Guys in the Room, which I co-authored. A book about Elliot Spitzer, the former governor of New York, who sort of blew himself up in a prostitution scandal. And then the topic of our conversation today, which is my first book and first magazine article, actually, about Genene Jones, a serial killer, pediatric nurse who killed children under her care. It's called and the book is called The Death Shift.
I'm going to have you come back on to talk about Enron because I'm interested in that as well, too. But death shifts is what we wanted to talk about today. Genene Jones, how did you come across her? I'm sure was it from the news when they were talking about this whole thing? Did you kind of hear a little bit from magazines and kind of start looking into it? But yeah, she did something in 1984, which I'm surprised we're still not talking about a whole lot today. Kind of seems like that would be like the first warning, like, don't go out in the street because there's cars. That would be her story. But could you just walk me through some of her story and obviously how you got started into it?
Sure, sure. Well, first, let me tell you about how I got started on the case, which is while it was unfolding, um, there were news reports on news wires about a nurse at a San Antonio charity hospital who was suspected of harming kids under her care, and no one had been indicted. She had not been charged at that point, but she was a suspect, and the charges and the details were so sensational that it got enormous attention, both nationally and internationally, even as it was under investigation. And at that point, I was actually this is back in 1983. I had been a newspaper reporter for a couple of years, and first in Baltimore and then in Dallas. And I was frustrated with journalism. I was about to leave the profession and go to law school, and I had a little time on my hands, and I contacted a friend I had who was then editor of Texas Monthly, and said I was available before I started law school at the University of Texas to do an article if he had an assignment for me. So when the story broke on the wires, he got in touch with me and asked me to look into this case. And I made a few calls. It turned out that one of the prosecutors investigating the matter was in a small town, was a rural DA in Junction, Texas, a ranching community. And he was one of the 2 DAs that was digging into what was going on. And he actually, that's actually the town where my college girlfriend had grown up, a very small place. And I contacted him, and his name's Ron Sutton, and he encouraged me to come on down and talk about the case. And I was sort of off to the races then. I ended up spending 4 months on the story, wrote my first magazine article. Texas Monthly offered me a job, and I've never left journalism. So that's my tale and how I got started on the case. Genene Jones is a whole different story. She was born in San Antonio. She had kind of she was adopted, one of children who were adopted by Dick and Gladys Jones. Her dad was a sort of larger than life figure in San Antonio. He ran a club called the Kit Kat Club. He was a gambler. He got in some trouble with the law periodically. Very flamboyant guy. And 2 of Genene's siblings died tragically. One blew himself up with a homemade bomb. And another died of cancer. And Genene, in high school in San Antonio, just sort of sort of suburb of the city, sort of growing part of the city, was a very sort of flamboyant personality, very emotional, very dramatic. Anyway, she had a troubled marriage. That's a whole story into itself. But she ended up first becoming a hairdresser at a beauty salon in a hospital, and from there she decided to become a nurse. And she worked at several nurses before she finally landed at the Bexar County Hospital, which was the charity hospital in San Antonio. And that's where the all the tragedy really started to unfold.
Now, when did they start noticing that something was wrong? I mean, how do you go from just being a nurse? I mean, being around babies, especially. I mean, they're particularly innocent, and you don't really get the vibe of, oh, I want to do something to this kid. You kind of want to take care of them. So I'm just wondering, like, I like how you gave a little bit of background on her, because that's my first thought is that something happened in her life. She said, and I guess her one of the documents that I read when it was about her certificate, she states that she just wasn't in the right set of mind. And I go, either she lost kids in the past or she can't have her own, or there was something that happened in her childhood that caused her to have this kind of disconnect or this kind of that led to this giant story.
Well, I'm not a psychologist, but I have looked into kind of after I got through with all of this and the facts unfolded. I did look into um, what pattern this reflected. But for starters, I think it's the case that it's clearly the case that she was, had enormous need for attention. Was enormously dramatic. And even as I said in high school, when her brother died, I mean, it's an incredibly tragic event, but um, she she kind of she sort of played it for all it was worth. Honestly, again, it's sort of hard to um, criticize someone for being upset about a sibling passing away, but it was sort of even by that standard, it was over the top. And that was the case with Genene for many, many years, even before she became a nurse. And and as she entered nursing, she got into trouble at a couple of the hospitals where she had worked, and there were sort of red flags that should have prompted people to not hire her in the first place. Um, you asked how it became apparent that she was harming kids, or the suspicions arose that she was harming kids. Um, what really happened, the most significant thing was that there was a pattern of kids dying under her care or getting sick and having emergencies under her care that were unexpected. And she worked the 3 to 11 shift at the Bexar County Hospital, later known as Medical Center Hospital. And informally, within the nursing staff and the medical staff, it became known as the death shift, which is why I titled the book that way. And there was just a very striking pattern of kids having unexpected emergencies and dying on her, under her care. Um, there were, I'm looking over at the statistics, refresh my memory, but there were 42 children that died in the ICU, the intensive care unit where she worked, the pediatric intensive care unit. And kids are in the ICU because they're sick and badly sick. They need intense care. But the pattern there of how many were dying and how many were dying under her was very striking. In the period from April 81 to June 82, there were 42 kids who died. 34 of them died on her shift. They eventually, years later, after this whole thing broke and there were multiple investigations, um, prosecutors called in the Centers for Disease Control to actually investigate what had happened in the ICU. And they investigated what happened in the pediatric ICU in San Antonio as though it were an epidemic. And they concluded that on a shift she worked, kids were 25 times as likely to suffer an arrest, where their heart stopped, they stopped breathing, they had a life-threatening emergency, and they were 10 times as likely to die. They essentially treated her as an epidemic, and she was the cause of the epidemic in their view.
How did she like, what did she do to them? That it was like a medication dosage wrong issue? I mean, were they all kind of the same, like obviously dosages that were wrong, or did they kind of vary?
Good question. No, there were different things, but one thing that clearly she was doing was giving kids injections of heparin, excessive injections of heparin, which is a blood thinning medication. And you use heparin in a hospital, especially in an ICU, routinely to avoid clots and intravenous lines and that sort of thing. But there were kids that were having horrible bleeding problems. Heparin's a blood thinner. and you use a very, again, a modest dose of it in order to avoid blood clots, and it's, very clear how much you should use. But there were kids that were having these episodes where they would bleed out from every pore in their body, and there was no reason for that to be happening. There's a condition that causes something like this, that causes bleeding from all your pores, from your injection sites, because your blood isn't clotting. It's called disseminated intravascular coagulation, or DIC, and it's results from a bad infection. And so when some of these kids had this problem, they thought it was a DIC case and wrote it off that way. But then it continued, and there were kids who were having this who had no reason to have that kind of problem. And they would bleed out. They would have these episodes when she was on duty. They'd get better on the next shift, and it would happen again when she came back on duty. And so there was a pattern of that. There were also other drugs that were later, where kids were later tested and results took place which showed she was giving kids other kinds of drugs that caused arrests.
Did they have cameras back then?
They did not. Well, they had cameras, but not monitoring the ICU in any way, shape, or form like that. And again, it was tricky because in an ICU, there's nurses in and out of a child's um, room frequently. There's many medications that are being pushed. There's intravenous lines that are already in. So it's really hard to isolate out that a particular nurse, and this particular nurse, did something specific to harm and then kill some of these kids. That was kind of the explanation for why it was so difficult to bring criminal charges against her in San Antonio, which actually didn't happen for decades, literally. Murder charges, that is. There was one injury to a child case I'll tell you about if a little bit later. But in San Antonio, um, the medical officials, despite direct accusations by nurses that Genene was harming kids, the line nurses who worked with her and some doctors went to supervisors and said, "We think she's hurting kids." One nurse went to the charge nurse in the ICU with a list of the children who had died in a period of time. And there were internal investigations that took place, multiple investigations. In one case, with experts brought in from the three top medical schools around the country. They conducted an investigation, and they clearly identified her as the source of the problem. And at no point during this time did the hospital, the medical school in San Antonio, alert the authorities to conduct a criminal investigation. Instead, they viewed her as they were worried about lawsuits. They were worried about bad publicity. They were trying to upgrade the county hospital to attract more private patients. And so ultimately what they did was they sent her off under the cover of upgrading the ICU to an all RN unit. She was a licensed vocational nurse. And they got rid of her by saying, "Oh, we're upgrading the ICU to all RNs, so we're going to move her out." But they sent her off and got rid of another nurse who did nothing wrong. They sent her off with a good recommendation. And she went off to a pediatric clinic in Kerrville, which is a rural area north of San Antonio. And there, in a period of 1 month, 8 kids who walked into a doctor's office with fairly routine medical problems stopped breathing in a period of 1 month and had to be rushed to the hospital. And one of those children, a little 15-month-old girl named Chelsea McClellan, died. And that's the case. What happened in Kerrville is what actually got criminal investigators going on all of this.
Now, did the hospital that she was transferred to or she relocated to, did they like look into this? And did they obviously, they didn't care about the scandal issues? I mean, that's how much was the first hospital criticized on just covering up something like that? I mean, I get the lawsuit aspect, but that's a really, really ethically huge issue right there. The fact that they didn't want to deal with the problem and they just let this person go, knowing full well that she was the cause of all these
Oh,
deaths.
it's an incredible part of the story, and that's actually why I thought this tale was worthy of a book as opposed to a 10,000 word magazine article that I'd already written. That Genene Jones was one thing, and obviously a horror, and um, did horrible things to children. It's the greatest betrayal you can imagine, to have a caregiver harming your kids. Um, but the people that enabled her, that allowed her to get away with it for as long as they did, looked the other way, refused to call on authorities when they clearly should have done that. That was a scandal, an enormous scandal. And there was I've seen, I reviewed all kinds of internal documents as I was doing my work on the book. And one of the things I came across was that they were literally discussing this at high level meetings with the top officials of the medical school. A very prominent surgeon who went to Harvard was chair of the committee, and they were discussing what to do about this problem on their hands. And they even after they got word of some of these problems starting to develop in Kerrville, in this pediatric clinic, in this doctor's office, where kids were unable to breathe and being rushed to the hospital, they counseled everyone to maintain what they called, quote, a judicious silence, unquote. It's actually a term that's in a memo of minutes of the meeting. And they did. They kept a judicious silence, which is a horror, and it was a scandal. And there was indeed litigation, and there was indeed scandal, which is exactly what they thought they were avoiding by sending her off without telling anyone.
Now, when it comes to those internal documents, was that exposed when the media first started reporting on this or when the story broke, or did that not come out until later?
No, it came out because of my reporting, in both first a little bit in my article, but then in my book. Um, those were not published. Those were not made public in any way, shape, or form. There was a treasure trove of sort of damning stuff that indicated that reflected internal studies that had done investigations that had been done about deaths that couldn't be explained. They detailed, list of 10. There's a report called the Mangos Report, an internal study that I got copies of, both in draft and final form, which reflected had summaries of about 8 or 10 cases, or 8 or 10 cases I recall, of deaths they couldn't explain, and it talked about each one of those cases, each one of those kids. Um, so they were very conscious that strange stuff was going on, troubling stuff was going on, and ultimately, again, failed to do what they should have done.
When it comes to the attribution of the deaths, like when it comes to Wikipedia says 60, or other articles might say she killed 60 kids. Um, how do they how do you not verify if it's like I get like one or two, three or four starts to be a little bit suspicious, but at the same time, it's a hospital as well. Two things can happen. I'm not justifying anything. I'm just trying to look at maybe a more rational number. I mean, you mentioned a little bit off air that it could have been like 8 to 15. I just want to know how you might have came to that thought. I mean, it makes a lot more sense. Just 60 sounds like a lot, where I'm like, even if it was like for business and you're covering up the scandal or you're aware of her killings, at five, if they're on that shift, you got to at least sit them down and like buy them like a donut and be like, hey, what's going on?
Well, they certainly weren't. The people that were suspicious about this certainly weren't being treated to donuts. They were harassed themselves. The supervisors were, in many cases, um, dismissive of the allegations that Janine's fellow nurses in San Antonio were serving up and were presenting them with. They were told not to talk about it, that they were gossiping. Janine was a very divisive figure. She had a very abrasive personality, but she was also very technically skilled. And so there were nurses and even doctors, in particular the leadership of the ICU, that thought highly of her and was very defensive of her. The charge nurse at the time, a woman named Pat Belko, had herself had a allegations brought against her decades earlier when she was a line nurse, and she clearly was sort of scarred by that experience and identified with what Janine was going through. And I think that contributed to her dismissiveness and her hostility to people, uh, colleagues, her nurses, warning that Janine was doing something. Um, so you asked also about the numbers, and again, because these kids are so sick, it was hard to identify and put your finger on exactly what was going on, but there was a clear association between her and these deaths and these emergencies. And not only that, sort of statistically, but anecdotally, her behavior was incredibly irresponsible and should have prompted her to be fired for multiple reasons for a period of years. Um, there was an incident, and I describe all of these in my book, The Death Shift. There was an incident where a child died, and she She grabbed the body away from the mourning family and like ran down the hall to take it to the morgue herself. And they were literally chasing after her down the hospital hallways. There was an incident where she appeared drunk after her shift and started fiddling with medical equipment and was caught. And then there was so there was sort of time and again when Genene would do crazy stuff. There was a note left for one of her accusers in her in her mailbox in the ICU, a nurse named Susanna Maldonado. And she was the one that had gone to the charge nurse with a list of kids who had died, who was warning about Genene. And this nurse, young nurse, RN, got a note in her mailbox which read, "You're dead. YOUR dead, DEAD." It was Genene's handwriting. There was no reason to think she had done it. It was just one of a series of things that should have gotten her fired, gotten them to call the authorities, and never happened. And the result of all this is again that she was sent off with a good recommendation, and we'll get to this later. But ultimately, she was not convicted of a murder in San Antonio, despite suspicions that she'd harmed a lot of kids. When the story broke about suspicions of harm in San Antonio and in Kerrville, that happened because the doctors in Kerrville, in this small town pediatric, in this small town hill country town north of San Antonio, had seen 8 kids in a period of a month rush to their emergency room who had stopped breathing, and they came in from a doctor's pediatric clinic where you go for colds. These were not very sick kids, and that got the attention of the doctors in the small town. They began investigation, and they confronted Genene's employer, a doctor named Kathy Holland, who had been a resident in San Antonio and then chosen to hire Genene as her office nurse after Genene was sent off with a good recommendation. When she opened up a clinic in this small town, pediatric clinic, she hired Genene as her office nurse. And when these episodes happened in this small town where they never see a kid in the emergency room, it was kind of a retirement community. But here they had 8 kids rush to the emergency room who had stopped breathing. They confronted the doctor. The doctor looked into her medical supplies and discovered a bottle of a drug called succinylcholine. And it's a little vial, glass vial with a rubber stopper on the top. Succinylcholine is a drug you give patients to intubate them, to put a breathing tube down their throat. So they're paralyzed, but they're conscious, and it keeps the patients from struggling against the breathing tube. And you only do it in a very controlled setting, in an operating room typically. And the doctor went back, and because she had been asked, it seemed like the kids, as they were recovering from the breathing episodes, one anesthesiologist in the ER had seen how they were behaving, and they were displaying jerky motions. One of the children was. And he thought he's an anesthesiologist, so he knew this. He said, "It looks like the kid is coming out from under succinylcholine." So they confronted the doctor. She went back to her office. She checked the vial of succinylcholine, and she had never used it. And she looked at the top, and there were needle marks on the top of the bottle. So somebody, obviously, that was a cause for enormous suspicion. It was later tested. It turned out that while the vial was full, as though it had not been used at all, there were needle marks on it. They tested the substance inside. It was 5,6 saline solution. So the drug had been used, injected into kids, when they were supposed to be getting just baby shots. The kids stopped breathing. And then after all of this happened, saline solution had been inserted back into the vial to make it appear that the drug had never been used.
We've all taken sips out of somebody's whiskey or something when they're not home, parents' whiskey or something, and
And water
found
it
this.
down.
Yeah, and found those little tricks. Did she ever admit? I would have to think. I mean, if she knew she's going to, I mean, could her charges double? I mean, she's in there for whatever she was being charged on. I don't know how long she was going to be sent away. Wasn't it like 87 years or something?
Well, one of the sort of really troubling things for many years was that Well, there were investigations of what happened in San Antonio by the big city DA's office, the Bexar County DA's office. And that was an investigation involved a lot of lawyers, investigators. They set up a special um, office, secure facility. It was actually the old jail in the county to gather evidence about what had happened. They compiled enormous amounts of material about what had happened in San Antonio in the county hospital. And that investigation went on for more than a year with top lawyers and and internal investigators, DA's investigators. Simultaneously, there was a parallel investigation of what happened in Kerrville at this in this pediatric clinic, where, as I said, 8 kids came in, needed baby shots, got routine injections, and stopped breathing. Um, the only case that was tried for murder back then was the death of one of the children in Kerrville, Chelsea McClellan, this 15-month-old little girl. The San Antonio investigation at the time ended um, after Genene was convicted at trial of murdering Chelsea McClellan, and she was sentenced to 99 years. And the Kerrville DA, Ron Sutton, led that prosecution. He had help from the San Antonio folks as well. And the thought was that she would be put away and spend the rest of her life behind bars. Um, with this in mind, the DA in San Antonio brought one case that he felt very good about, which was an injury to a child case of a child who survived. A fellow named Rolanda Santos, a little baby named Rolanda Santos. This child had, in the pediatric ICU, had one of these bleeding episodes, and it happened repeatedly, where he was bleeding out when Genene was on duty, got better when she was not on duty, when she left, then happened again and again. And it happened about 3 times. And the doctor who was his attending physician, physician named Ken Copeland, ordered that all the heparin be removed from his room, and then actually moved him out of the ICU. And yet, one more time, it happened again, and he was bleeding, and he was on the verge of death. And this doctor ordered injection of a drug that's an antidote to heparin that reverses the effects of heparin, called protamine. And he pushed an injection of that, and it's a very risky thing to do. But he specifically was strongly suspecting, that this child had received an overdose of heparin. And he pushed the protamine, he pushed another injection of protamine, and the bleeding stopped. And that child survived, and is an adult today. But that's the only case that the San Antonio DA prosecuted. It was for injury to a child. And they prosecuted that case after Genene had been convicted of Chelsea McClellan's murder. She was convicted in San Antonio and got another 60-year sentence there for injury to a child. Those 2 sentences were to run concurrently. And after that all happened, the DA in San Antonio basically said, there's no purpose served in prosecuting Genene further and pursuing murders in San Antonio, because she's going to be behind bars for the rest of her life. He was also under a lot of political pressure from powerful people in San Antonio who wanted to minimize the scandal for the county hospital and for the county. And so he did not pursue any more charges, either murder cases against Genene. He noted that they were very difficult to prove, and they are difficult to prove. But he also had been urged by his staff to prosecute the hospital officials and medical school officials, and even bring an indictment against the institution for failing to report and for covering up what happened. There was an actual draft of a charge that was prepared by his staff, and he decided not to proceed, again on the thinking that Genene was going to remain behind bars for the rest of her life. So 99 years and 60 years, but it wasn't going to play out that way, as it turned out, as became evident later. Texas had passed a mandatory release law to ease prison overcrowding. And as a result of that, Genene was going to be up for mandatory release, not just parole, but she would have to be released in 2018 after she'd served about a third of her sentence at the age of 67. And so, the case then started to resurface, and that's a whole nother part of the tale.
Did any of the witnesses or any of the staff members that worked with her feel comfortable talking about it or doing interviews about this subject, or maybe some things that they found suspicious, their own experience around her? Like, I have to think, if you're in, I didn't even think about the shaming of nurses or the harassment from, board officials and other medical people that it might be, higher up. But after you said it, I was kind of thinking, I was like, I wonder if any of them were still kind of scared, whether, I mean, you have a job, you're about to lose your job, but I have to think it's just, you have to think from a mother's perspective. Are they gonna have that initial response to protect, not even if it's their own kid, and they see this horrible thing going on? I mean, can they, how do they tip anonymously when you need evidence, to be able to pursue this?
Yeah, well, they were very courageous. I mean, the doctors and nurses who were suspicious of Genene, particularly nurses, were very courageous. They didn't, excuse me, they approached their supervisors and literally said, "We think some of them, a few of them, very outspoken ones, said, we think she's killing kids. We think she's harming kids." They were horrified. They were aghast. They were screaming for something to be done about it. And at some levels, they were met, as I said, with scolding. Don't spread gossip unless you have proof of this. Um, I mean, it was sort of the worst possible situation they could imagine. And they were trying to get the supervisors to do something about it. There were internal investigations done, but they ultimately didn't do anything really to stop her or to alert authorities about her. And she was allowed to go off to harm kids in Kerrville. And again, the result in the death of this child, Chelsea, this beautiful little girl, Chelsea McClellan, um, who was injected twice with succinylcholine, and died on the way to being rushed to a hospital after she'd stopped breathing. Um, her case was especially tragic. Um, she had come in for routine baby shots, um, and Janine had injected her. She stopped breathing. She was rushed to the hospital. Um, anyway, and then ultimately she died on the way to San Antonio, at a tiny little hospital on the highway. And
Well, I was going to ask,
that's the case. That's the case where Janine was convicted of murder.
I was gonna ask if you trace the ramifications after her conviction. Did nursing law changes, anything that happens to do with the board of ethics? I mean, I know for a fact there's multiple cases when I was little that my mom would not leave the hospital room. Doesn't even matter if it's a routine checkup, just had to be in the room there with a doctor just because she was weary of all these kind of scandals and things like that. And I'm like, if you're watching the news and you see that this person's being convicted, or there's this case that's going on about all these babies' deaths, you immediately start having mistrust issues in your nursing staff at your hospitals, your doctors. You don't want to take your kid there when they're having maybe a cold or something, unless it's super serious, and you're not going to leave that room. And those are ramifications, whether it's media reporting, whether you want to say it's just the public's perception, but those all start to take effect when something like this breaks.
They do, but none of that was known until after it broke as a story. And again, a little bit in the wire services and the local newspaper. It's obviously front page, huge headlines. But at the time Janine was doing this stuff, first in San Antonio and then in Kerrville, the parents had no suspicions whatsoever of her. She was incredibly ingratiating and made a point of it to all the parents. She acted like she cared more than any of the other doctors and nurses. She would badmouth other nurses. She would, make a point of courting them and, um, you know, telling them how much she cared for their children, and they bought it. They believed it. They thought she was a nurse who was, truly very caring, and they had no reason really not to think that. Um, and so none of that suspicion took place at the time, and that was true in Kerrville too. As I mentioned, Chelsea McClellan, she got baby shots, stopped breathing. She was rushed to the hospital and recovered from that first episode. But the parents thought Janine had tried to, had saved her. They thought she was a hero nurse, and that was the case with many parents, because the kids had emergencies, and Janine was always in the middle of the emergency, performing CPR, hovering around the code. in the middle of all the excitement, and she was portraying herself as the person who saved these children's lives, and the parents had every reason to, think that was the case. The notion that a nurse would deliberately harm kids, the one who looks like she's saving the kid, was very, very far from their minds. Now,
That was what I was gonna ask you at the beginning was, do you think it's gonna be speculation, but some of these in the beginning when the kids first started dying, um, that she thought maybe she could save and get that heroic reward aspect of things. But then I just have this picture in my mind of the first kid dying and then someone going in like, hey, it's okay. Things happen and it's out of your way. Then there's that grief aspect. And it's like you're still getting attention either way. I mean, it goes back to the attention thing from, her high school drama, all that. It's that feeling afterwards of grief. I mean, we all know some people that, they lose a loved one, but they necessarily weren't close, but they act like it's this huge thing and they keep using it. And it's horrible, but it's real and it happens and people do it. But that's what I started speculating. I was like, was it a factor of maybe she could be the hero and try and save this kid after they made him sick? Or was it a factor of she just liked the grief aspect of it? I mean, you don't know what killing is until you do it. And then you kind of get whatever that is after.
no, that's a really interesting area and good question. There's no question that she was um, very dramatic when children died. She would wail constantly. She would wail loudly and for long periods of time in a way that was very unusual for a nurse because nurses in the pediatric ICU deal with death. And, certainly, understandable to view it as a tragedy, but it was so strange, how sort of hysterically she would act. That in itself was troubling. But in terms of what was behind all this, what's the motivation for somebody who does things like this? It's tricky. But there is a pattern that she fit into. First of all, she liked the attention. She always wanted to be the center of attention. She liked the excitement of a code. Whenever there was a code where you're trying to save a child's life, she was at the center of it. She would be sweaty and it seemed excited and insisted, even when it wasn't her patient, that she'd be right there and involved. And that was striking in itself. Um, and then there's a pattern of that is called Munchausen syndrome by proxy that she fit into. And I've read about this, and there's been a few other cases, sort of infamous cases about that suggest this. But Munchausen syndrome is where you essentially fabricate or then present to a hospital or doctors claiming that you have serious medical problems because you get some sort of gratification out of procedures, complicated procedures being performed on you, and the attention that comes with it. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is where you inflict symptoms or cause problems for someone else. In particular, you're a caregiver or a parent, and there's a phenomenon of fortunately fairly rare but present and known that of parents or nurses who parents, let's start with that, who bring their kids in for care to a hospital saying, my child stopped breathing, my child has this problem and that problem, and they make a crazy number of visits to a doctor's office or to a hospital emergency room, and the doctors look at the children, test them, look for these problems, and they can't find them. They can't find any underlying cause. And that's what I think was going on with Genene, that she was creating these medical illnesses, creating these emergencies, and because she then wanted to be the center of attention, she wanted to be the hero. And by the way, she didn't just do this with patients. She brought her own children in for medical care repeatedly, in a very dramatic way. And I talk about all of this in my book. And doctors would say she brought in her child claiming that she had stopped breathing. She had two kids, by the way, had this emergency, and they'd say they couldn't find any evidence it was true. They eventually urged that she get psychological counseling. This is while she was still a nurse in the San Antonio hospital. They said it didn't seem to add up. And so this was phenomenon both with her own children and then certainly with her patients.
I remember watching Sixth Sense and the mom was poisoning the kid to make him sick still. But then there's plenty of episodes I've seen. I think it's like Worst Medical Encounters. And there is like a mother that was giving her kid peanuts when the nurse would leave the room and her kid was allergic to peanuts and have these horrible allergic reactions. And I'm like, I can't understand that. I mean, everything I think in society tells you want to protect your kids, and just protect kids in general. But you know, this has a cautionary tale written. I mean, even for doctors as well too, and nurses, I would have to think that there's a code out there that they could write things down to be able to, suspicious activity at me when their colleagues are doing, just so they hold themselves accountable a little bit more as well too.
They're supposed to be reporting suspicious deaths if they can't explain them. And in San Antonio, when these kids would die, they should have been, uh, when they died under unexplained or certainly suspicious circumstances, they should have been the cases should have been turned over to the medical examiner, who would conduct a serious autopsy, try to investigate the cause of death. And he was one of the people that was furious, when he learned sort of third hand about the pattern of what was going on, that these cases had not been reported to him for criminal investigation, and said that had they, done what they should have done, had the hospital turned over these cases, asked that autopsies be conducted, handled it properly, that a number of kids could have lived who did not make it. There's, one of the things that, for decades was a huge source of anguish in San Antonio was that, on the premise that Genene would serve the rest of her life behind bars, none of the kids who died in San Antonio at the ICU, and again, we think, I think a good estimate is 8 to 15, something in that order, who died, and many more who suffered emergencies. Um, None of those kids, murders were ever charged for many, many years. And so those parents felt like, the harm that was done to their children the justice was never done. And that remained the case for decades. Um, and that brings, that brings up sort of us to the more recent period of time when Janine, in her 60s it appeared she was going to be released on mandatory release. um, that's when those parents really swung into action. They were actually led by Petty McClellan, who was Chelsea McClellan's mom, the mom of the little girl whose murder Jeanine had been convicted of. She kind of led the parents in San Antonio, many of whom were poor minority families, because they had gone to this, their kids had been treated at the charity hospital. They didn't have a choice about going to some high end private hospital, but their kids had been treated there, and they had died, and some cases under very suspicious circumstances. In some cases, Janine likely killed them, and they felt like none of this had been addressed. And so they were a very powerful force at the point that there was a possibility that Genene Jones would be released on parole, in pressuring the DA's office in San Antonio. This is several DAs later, to bring new murder charges against Janine to keep her behind bars. And that was a whole sort of separate tale of the story, which started out as my first article, when had a lot more hair, sort of resurfaced in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, as a whole other effort to try to bring new murder charges against her decades later, when they felt they couldn't do it way back in the 1980s. And that effort was actually led by a young prosecutor named Jason Goss in the DA's office, and he kind of took up the mission to try to bring new murder charges against her, and ultimately did. He brought 5 new murder charges against her, each of them with a $1 million bond, which kept her behind bars in prison after her Texas prison term had expired. And then they moved forward toward trial, um, and we're on the first of those 5 murders, and ultimately Janine pled guilty on the eve of trial, and she's now still in prison as a result.
And she'll be there probably until she dies.
Almost certainly, almost certainly.
I wonder if even if she knows she's not going to get out of prison, she's going to end up dying in there, if she would admit or say anything to give closure to some of the families as well too, on the number she realistically did kill. And I just feel like for the families, especially if you are going there to make sure that she stays in prison, this is something you need. I mean, it's not going to be over until obviously she's dead, but at the same time, you can get some aspects of closure as well too.
Well, certainly the parents would like that. She ultimately pled guilty to just one additional murder. Um, um, a child who had died after being burned in a house fire, um, and then seemed to be recovering in the ICU, and then took a turn for the worse and passed away. Um, so she eventually, again, on the eve of trial, because as this was barreling down on her, she finally pled guilty. But she had previously um, insisted on her innocence for decades. There were a couple of occasions, as I described. I sort of went back and updated the book and did a new edition of my book because this whole sort of new part of the tale. And she ultimately, as I said, pled guilty. Um, but it's when it came time to um, when the sentencing took place, the judge and the parents um, uh, poured into her. The parents were allowed to give victim statements essentially on behalf of their kids, and there was some sense of closure in that way. Although only one of the families saw her actually plead guilty to a murder charge. One of the five families, but all of them were represented at the sentencing and gave very powerful statements. Genene remained silent through it all. She said nothing.
Did she ever talk about her state of mind, or, you know, if she was getting pleasure from it? If she was, I know we speculated a little bit in the beginning of maybe some things why, but I'm just wondering if she ever made a full statement about it. I mean, I understand she probably pled innocent for a while, but now, I mean, I think the overwhelming evidence is like there's not a maybe in this. This is that you did it and we got you on a couple of them. We can't maybe verify them all. So I think after a while of saying that you're innocent, it probably just gets old, and she probably just started rolling with, yeah, that she was guilty. Um, but I mean, even when it comes to what was her state of mind, what was she thinking about when did she do it for pleasure? Did she do it for attention? Did she do it? That's
Well, I interviewed her several times, actually. I interviewed her first when I was.
Did you smell sulfur? Did you smell sulfur?
There were issues. So I interviewed her several times. First, when she was living in a trailer home in West Texas back in 1983, when she was a suspect, but had not been publicly identified as a suspect. I mean, I knew she was. Um, and she was living in a trailer home with several other people. It was kind of an odd assortment of folks. A nurse who'd stood by her, a young unwed mother who Genene had sort of taken in, whose baby was mysteriously raced to the hospital while she was living with her. um, anyway, I interviewed her for I think 4 or 6 hours in this trailer home, and by the way, while I was there, she repeatedly asked me if I wanted to have something to drink or eat, and I
No, don't
said,
take
"No, thank
anything.
you. No, thank you." Um, Actually had a signal with my editor on how to, assure him through a phone call that everything was okay.
She asks you what to eat. She's like, "What's food? I don't know what food is."
Yeah, no, I passed on her invitation, but I described that again both in the article and the book, and she was like dressed for the meeting like it was a Saturday night date. She was all dressed up. Her makeup was very careful, but she didn't just not comment. She didn't decline comment on the situation. She vehemently insisted that she had done nothing wrong, that she had saved babies, that the doctors and nurses had screwed up. She threw out gossip to me about this doctor is sleeping with this nurse and this doctor committed malpractice, and she had an explanation for everything. She didn't just simply sort of shrug her shoulders and said, I don't know what happened. She denied doing anything wrong, and she went on the attack, and it was very dramatic. And that was her way. She swore that the doctors had committed malpractice, and that's why. And there was incompetent care in the hospital, and it was everyone's fault but hers. And she was fighting for the kids, and that was completely her point of view. Um, I then interviewed her again after she was convicted, when she was in Gatesville, Texas prison, and that was about when I was doing the book. It was about 3 or 4 years later. And she had a bit of a different tone. She spoke about how she was finding religion. She was considering the Jewish religion, as she put it. Uh, she was less sort of angry sounding, but she also, again, vehemently insisted she'd done nothing wrong. Again, said it was the fault of others and that she had been fighting for the kids. And through the decades that followed, there were two incidents where she appeared to be acknowledging some measure of guilt. One was in a parole interview with a parole officer, and she basically said, "I really did harm. I did harm the kids, and or I did it," or it was sort of a cryptic comment. And I described this in detail, the sort of meeting that took place. And then she also wrote a letter. I think you mentioned this at one point earlier. Um, when there was a thought that she was going to get out of prison, the Texas Nursing Board belatedly actually moved to cancel her nursing license, which I think they had just suspended until that point, lest there be any prospect that she'd get out of prison and actually be able to return to nursing, um, which is, of course, a horrifying thought. And she wrote a letter in response to their inquiry to her, where they asked her if she had something she wanted to say. And it was a semi-confessional letter. And I got my hands on that years later and wrote a story about that. And it's included again in the whole tale. Um, but other than that, for the most part, she's offered no confession. She's insisted privately, um, in letters to her sort of prison correspondence, that she was wronged. I obtained letters that she sent to various folks who sort of allied themselves with her, Christian ministry sort of people, where she insisted she had done nothing wrong and she was being crucified and it was horrible how she was being treated, that sort of thing. That was her tone for the vast majority of her time in prison, and up until the day that she went to court and agreed to plead guilty. There are occasional acknowledgments or semi-acknowledgments that she had done something wrong, even what seemed like a quasi confession. But for most of the time, she insisted she was innocent.
I want to take it back to your first interview with her at that trailer. When you left that trailer after she offered you food and drink and she asked what your blood type was, did did you at any moment feel like maybe that she was being truthful, as that she was being targeted? I mean, look, I know that's a hard jump probably from what you've known now, but I feel like some people, like, you end up talking to them and it's like, is it possible? Like, that society has so many instances where there's always been multiple variations of that instance and happening in different ways, whether it was an institution's fault, whether it was a lie, whether there's a nurse, whether it was and it's just it's so hard to tell. And then, you're hearing this person double down, and if they didn't seem like they're breaking, you can kind of be convinced by what they're saying. You're kind of soaking up. They're like, okay, maybe this might have some weight to it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that visit was incredibly enlightening, for multiple reasons, and that's one of them. Because as I stood there listening to her, she answered every question I asked. Again, I think it actually went 6 hours that I was sitting there with her. And
No food or drink for 6 hours. Oh my God.
it's okay. uh, and and she responded to every single question in detail. She had an explanation for every single incident that occurred. She spelled it out, went on and on about what had happened. And and she was incredibly compelling. And as I was sitting there across from her, and as that happened, and as I left, I appreciated how she was able to enlist supervisors and some other nurses and doctors to her point of view, that she was a great nurse, that she had fought for the kids, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that there were other explanations for what had happened. Um, I came away, I got it. I understood how, why some people would have that view. But then as I sort of drove off and thought about all this, I thought about the individual things she said. And every element, almost every element of what she said had some sort of hard contradiction to it. Not just other people I'd talked to, and I talked to dozens of doctors and nurses that worked with her firsthand. I'd looked at a ton of documents. They were, medical records that reflected what had taken place, and I would see much more stuff when I did the book. But I thought about it, and there were all this hard evidence and other interviews that flat out contradicted what she said, and you know was completely persuasive, indisputable. But nonetheless, in her presence, I sort of felt the spell that she wove.
Dude, I mean, that's when you first contacted her and then you ended up contacting her later, did she remember you?
Yes. You mean when I saw her in prison?
Yeah.
Yeah, she did. She did remember me. I wrote to her in prison. I had to be put on the prison admit list. Um, and again, spent a lot of time with her when I saw her in prison. Um, so she certainly remembered me. Um, she didn't talk explicitly about whether she'd read my Texas Monthly story, um, which had appeared in August of, I think, 83, 4 years old, about 4 years earlier. But um, when I mentioned that there was a parole interview years later where she offered what amounted to a quasi confession. It was taken as a confession of sorts by the parole officer, and she actually wrote up a conversation in her report about the interview with Genene. But in that interview, while she's sitting there with Genene, Genene said what she said, um, and she said, "And I don't want this to appear in Texas Monthly." So
She had to see your article. She had to. I wonder if she was thinking, what do I say to this guy? That's the thing is like I don't think I would have the courage to be able to even try and track that down or do that interview process. I mean, good for you on that one. That's a difficult thing. I mean, is there any I would say other people that reported on this that is this land in like a controversial area? I started noticing this about like a lot of these stories is that there's different perspectives on how people think that this went or this went. I'm just curious if there's any, I guess, I mean, if it's a full group agreement that obviously she killed these kids.
I don't think there's, well, um, she had a few allies in prison, and as I mentioned, I obtained her prison correspondence with them, as well as with a man who had been friends with her for many years, um, who actually she asserted was the father of one of her children. And it's a whole, you know extraordinary Janine story unto itself. She asserted this man had fathered her child, um, when they were both drunk, and he was really the father of the kid. Well, the man actually is gay, openly gay now, and said it was a complete fabrication. And they had a long mail exchange about whether he was really the father of the kid or wasn't. And she finally got furious when he said, "No, that's not possible." Um, anyway, I'm sorry, I lost track of it. You were asking me about.
Any areas that were controversial. I
Oh
mean,
yeah, yeah, yes. I'm sorry.
that was a
So
good one. I like that. That's interesting.
yeah, no,
It's
it's a
weird. Her dad was flamboyant, you mentioned in the beginning. So if her dad was gay, it's just, I don't know. I don't, maybe
Oh
that's
no, he wasn't gay. He wasn't gay. There's no reason to think that. He was sort of he was a gambler. He ran a club called the Kit Kat Club. He was kind of a rough and tumble character in San Antonio, very well known. One point, he was accused of stealing a safe, and later said sort of was a prank. Um, anyway, he was a very, as I said, a very colorful character. Um,
did he die before all this happened or did
Yes,
he?
he did. The mom was alive for much of this time. She had drinking issues, alcohol issues. Um, she had a very stormy relationship with Janine. Um, at one um, terribly stormy relationship, Janine sort of dumped her kids with the grandmother, without respect for whether she was able to take care of them. given her own physical condition. Um, and after Janine's mom had died, as the prosecutors were seeking to persuade her in, I think 2020, I think it was, to plead, actually, yeah, 2020, to plead guilty to these new murder charges, to as opposed to going to trial. One of the things they did was file a list of crimes or alleged crimes or relevant events that that had taken place that they were going to allege in trial. And one of them was that Janine at one point had put a gun to her mother's head. Um, so as I said, they had a terribly stormy
It's a
relationship,
stormy relationship for
to say the
sure.
least. To say the least. Um, and other than a few sort of Christian missionary types that sided with her, there wasn't much debate about. There weren't many people. There really weren't any people that were defending her. Her lawyers did a noble job to try to offer her defense, but um, there wasn't a controversy about whether she'd done something wrong, to say the least.
Do you think that aspect of finding a new religion, do you think that was like a thing to kind of help with maybe the possibility of getting parole?
It's impossible to know whether somebody's sincere or not, but there certainly is a pattern of people who are facing charges, particularly horrible charges of finding God. Whether they're driven to it sincerely or it's opposed is impossible to tell. But her religion seemed to be kind of a fungible thing. I mean, one point she was, as she said to me, she was contemplating the Jewish religion. Another point, she was wearing cross and she was writing to corresponding with Christian missionaries. At the same time, she could still be profane and nasty um, and obviously completely deceitful, which is, needless to say, not a particularly Christian approach.
I'm surprised that, like, usually you hear about someone that does something to kids and they end up in prison. They usually don't, they get roughed up or something, or they don't make it. Um, I'm surprised that she's, hadn't had any complications if she's been able to make friends in prison. I mean, even if turning over a new leaf and realizing what you did wrong, or allegedly realizing what you did wrong, there is this like, maybe this different from male prisons to women's prisons, but
I think there's probably an element of that. It's not saying I'm terribly familiar with, but I don't think she had. Um, there were certainly some skirmishes with some other inmates, but nothing, you know, hugely dramatic or life threatening for her. She did have a variety of medical illnesses, and again, with her, it's hard to know how much those were real versus claimed. She
did,
wrote,
did her cellmates have any medical illnesses?
well, that no, I think not, not that I know of, but she wrote very dramatic letters describing her alleged medical conditions, which were sort of preposterous. It's like, how can you still be alive if all of these things that you're saying are wrong with you were true? As well as complaining about the treatment that she had received medically. There's, I don't think there's impeccable medical treatment in Texas prisons, but there's no reason to think that she was, horribly mistreated.
Through all your work that you've done into this case, do you feel like you might be weary of certain aspects of like just the medical system or just business in general? I'm not asking if you have doubts in our system. I'm just asking if you're just a little bit. I mean, it's a cautionary tale. I mean, whether it still happens today is that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is just, I mean, you learn about all this about the people, that nurses staff that were harassed or either made quiet, just kept quiet. And then you see this person, how they were just push them on to the next hospital. We don't want to deal with it. We don't want the scandal. I mean, that's a message right there where it's kind of just like when you learn that, you kind of, I mean, you go into life with like I said, a cautionary tale.
Yeah, I mean, accountability is a big deal, and it's been a theme in properly, I think, not just in what I report, but ProPublica where I work and Fortune where I worked previously. Um, as I've written not just about this case, which was the first big one, but as I've written about corporate scandal and personally outrageous behavior, and um, it's far too often tolerated. And it's one thing for people to do for bad people to do terrible things. It's another thing altogether for the sort of array of people that enable it. And that was true very much for Genene Jones with the doctors who, you know, investigated, um, said, literally gave instructions to maintain a judicious silence about the whole matter, never called the authorities, sent her off with a good recommendation to, to provide cover for getting rid of her. And it's true also, was it true at Enron for the people who, the board of directors who had every reason to get engaged, stop bad things from happening, and particularly accountants and lawyers um, and investment bankers who enabled lots and lots of bad stuff that Enron did. It's true, on almost any business scandal, and many government scandals. That it's not just the bad actors, but the people that allow it to happen, either by turning a blind eye or being negligent in terms of their supervisory responsibilities.
Well, Peter, I really appreciate the time you gave me to walk me through this story, walk me through some of your work as well too. And I really appreciate the time you gave me to chat on my show. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Sure. Yeah. No, I have a website, www.peterelkind.net, and then my books are certainly for sale. There's a lot more to the Genene Jones story. Again, the book's called The Death Shift. Here's in the interest of promotion, self promotion. Here's
It's
the
a good
cover of the
cover.
book. It's certainly available on Amazon, as are my book about Enron, co-authored book about Enron called The Smartest Guys in the Room, and Client Nine about Elliot Spitzer. So people are, love it for people to dig into all of this deeper, and in particular on the Genene Jones story, which is an incredible tale.
Well, I'm going to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.